Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and this one I'm going over my round 5 game from the St. Louis Norm Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 4 video, you know that I lost my 4th game in a row, and this has really not been my tournament. I've pretty much been struggling round to round and have not been able to sort of get my composure together and, play a decent game, so I was hoping that maybe round 5 would be different. My opponent in this one was Grandmaster Evgeny Shtembuliak, a very young player, born in '99, I believe, so 20 years old, college-age individual, and he goes to one of these chess universities that I talk about all the time that gives scholarships to really strong players. I can't recall off the top of my mind which one he goes to, but he is in the States. He is studying. And, very talented GM. He's originally from Ukraine, I believe. So, any case, I was black, and Evgeny was white, and I knew it was going to be a tough test. Always a tough test when you're playing black against strong players. So, I was just trying to see what happens. So, anyway, Evgeny opened with G3. This was actually a surprise to me because, G3 you don't normally see every day. I mean, you see knight F3 happen and sometimes, and then G3, but G3 right away actually, not B6. It actually invites E5, and black can basically play like a perk type of system, a tempo up. So I was a bit surprised that he went for this, but maybe after E5 he would have gone for English instead with C4. But G3 is very flexible, and from move 1, I could tell he was trying to just get a position, and I wanted to get a position on my terms, so I instead opted for D5, which is actually my more reliable move. In many instances, I'm playing D5 base structures anyway, so I didn't want to get something that I hadn't really looked at. So at the risk of, not being super creative or original, I decided to just play what I normally play. After knight F3, I went knight F6, and then after bishop G2, I actually went C6. And my intent with C6 was to go for kind of like a reverse London system where you put this bishop out to F5 and the pawn on E6. If you recall from my tournament at the Grenke Chess Open, I actually had a really nice game there in the reverse London system with black in round 8. So I was hoping to kind of do something similar. And then actually in that same tournament with white, I had another really nice London system against a Grandmaster in the last round. So I kind of felt familiar with these systems where my bishop gets out of the pawn chain and was hoping to get something like that. But in this position after C6, Evgeny went for C4, and this actually really surprised me because typically I'm able to reinforce on C4 with E6, and so normally what happens is they castle first, and then after bishop F5, C4, E6, I really want to recapture on the D5 pawn with the E pawn and keep the structure like that. But instead, because he played C4 before castling, if I actually want to go bishop F5, I have to actually take the pawn with the C pawn. And even though this is actually fine for black, I wasn't particularly aware of the details at the time of this game. And one of the lines I was worried about is this early queen b3, which is a move that is played that takes advantage of the bishop coming out too early. So I was just a little bit worried about this kind of version of the system. And I knew that queen b6 was a move, but I thought that I might be slightly worse in endgame after queen takes b6, a takes b6. And I hadn't really checked out the details of this type of position, so I was uncomfortable going for it. Again, note that if he castles first, let's say castles, bishop f5, c4, e6, and c takes d5 first, and then e takes d5, and now queen b3. Queen b6 is actually well met here because this version of the pawn structure after queen takes b6, a takes b6 is actually really good for black. Note that there's this really nice pawn chain here that's kind of stymieing white's fianchettoed bishop on g2, and the half-open file looks really good for me. And the fact that I took with the e pawn means that the c6 pawn is still covering the very important b5 square, which is typically very sensitive to knight c3 and b5. So essentially, this version I would have been comfortable with, but the version where I take with the c pawn I wasn't, and because of that, I actually decided not to go for bishop f5 and went for e6 instead. But this was, played with profound disappointment because I basically was getting a setup I really did not want to go for, and I didn't really want to go for a closed Catalan in this game, so it was very frustrating. Now white played b3, and this was another source of frustration because in this particular move order, when it's like an English Catalan hybrid without playing the pawn to d4, white actually has really great flexibility with delaying the pawn to d4 to just put the bishop on b2 and influence the long diagonal. So this kind of move order actually is really, really smart and takes advantage of my very early e6 and c6, because now it's kind of unrealistic to play for e5 or c5 relatively quickly because I already made e6 and e6, and I'd be wasting tempo going for e5. So really, this particular move order gave him a very, very nice position, and he kind of just tricked me pretty much. So yeah, I was really not very happy with my position, and I kind of was deciding, I want to maybe freestyle from here because it already seemed like it was quite unpleasant. So I actually decided to play, instead of bishop e7, I actually decided to go bishop d6. And bishop d6 is very, very unusual, but because normally this bishop on d6 is just biting on granite on the g3 pawn, so normally it's much better served on e7. But my idea was that if white was going to delay this d-pawn from coming to d4, well, maybe I can play for e5. So my thought process was, with the bishop on d6, I'll play e5, maybe my knight comes to d7, and my queen comes to e7. And normally the queen on d8 has a hard time finding shelter to connect the rooks, and so I thought with my bishop on d6, my queen could come to e7, eventually connecting my rooks and be well placed there. So I thought, okay, if he's not going to play d4, I'm going to play for e5 and take the center. White now went bishop d2, which temporarily stops e5. That's a good move. And now I went castles, and now white also castled, and now I went queen e7. And again, my idea was very straightforward, just to play for e5, get this e5 move in. But here, white actually played d4, and I think this highlights the issue with my particular structure, is that now that I have the bishop on d6 and queen on e7 and e5 isn't played, these pieces are actually a touch misplaced. One reason for that is that when white eventually breaks on e4, there's potential for a knight to hit my bishop on d6, and I really don't want to lose the two bishops. That's one problem. Another problem is there are some lines where after e4 you actually just let white go e5 and take the space, and after you move the knight, get counterplay with c5. But the issue is, as long as my bishop is on d6, after e4 I'm kind of obliged to take because of this fork. So these factors actually make it so that the queen on e7 and bishop on d6 are not a very attractive combo, and white has really gotten the better of this opening sequence. What follows in this game pretty much is me trying to justify the setup and flailing while doing so, and I really never quite got into the game. And I mean, a bit of foreshadowing here, but you're going to see from several of the next moves that white's really playing quite freely, playing all the natural moves, and I'm trying to justify my setup with the bishop on d6 and queen on e7, and not quite doing it. So anyways, after d4, I went b6 now, but again, this is kind of a weird setup now to go for b6, bishop b7, when the idea was originally to play for e5. Instead, a better try probably would have been knight bd7, with the intent to actually go e5 regardless, even if it means I get an isolated pawn or cede the center. But yeah, after knight c3, white is definitely for choice regardless. One of the huge problems is that in a line after e5, there's c takes d5, and after c takes d5, there's a lot of times knight b5, which secures the bishop pair, because if the bishop drops back to b8, there's actually bishop a3, which picks up an exchange. So really big problems for me in this position after knight bd7 anyway. So anyways, b6, knight c3, knight bd7, and I still had some dreams of maybe playing e5, but yeah, it wasn't quite going to happen with me taking a little bit of time to develop my other pieces, and it really meant that white was going to be the one to strike in the center first with e4. And a lot of times, frankly, what happens in these Catalan structures, these closed Catalan structures, is that when white actually plays e4, he secures a very slight but nagging advantage because he has more space in the center after d takes e4, and white's fianchettoed bishops are really well placed and primed for the position to actually open up. So white does a really good job of just restraining the black pieces to the last 3 ranks. Anyways, after knight bd7, queen c2 is played. This kind of revs up the engine for e4, so it makes a lot of sense. And I went for bishop b7, just connecting my rooks. And now white went e4, and it's all very logical. And again, you could see that this queen on e7, bishop on d6 are very, very misplaced. And so I'm pretty much obliged to take, which means that I get a slightly worse position. I played knight takes e4. The part of the reason I did that actually was after d takes e4, I was actually wary of a move like knight g5. Point being that after taking twice on e4 with the knight, then the bishop on d6 is hanging, and again, I didn't want to lose the 2 bishops, so I thought it was actually a little bit more precise to first take the pawn with the knight, just to not allow knight g5 resources. Sorry, I'm messing up with hitting squares right now because I don't have a mouse at the moment, so forgive me for that. But anyways, you can see here that the queen on e7 is covering the g5 square. So knight g5 is not a possibility. But anyways, knight takes e4 is played, d takes e4, and queen takes e4. And this is like a textbook example of this like nagging closed Catalan advantage that white can have once they break with e4, because white controls my pawn break quite well with e5, and c5 is impossible because my bishop is pinned. The other issue is that if I go knight f6 to challenge the queen can actually just drop back to e2. And again, it's just a nagging advantage because even if I do get in c5, white still has more space, and this bishop is actually primed and ready for the diagonal to be open. So a lot of times a move like rook a d1 just secures white a nice safe advantage after, like, let's say c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop g2, king g2, and white's just a little bit more active on the diagonal and on the central files. And a lot of times this queen could come to f3 and replace the bishop on the light square diagonal, and white just has a very, very nice slight advantage. So instead, I kind of did not want to play in this defensive posture for like 30 or 40 moves, even though it probably was the best course of action, and lashed out somewhat irrationally with the move f5. Now, my idea with f5 is that, I'm getting a pawn break in, if you will. Not quite a pawn break, but I'm pushing a pawn. I'm taking a little bit of the initiative, maybe controlling a light square. But the bad thing is that I'm creating a weakness on e6, and when you're worse, you kind of want to not play weaknesses. It's not really a great idea, and so you really want to be a little bit safer, if you will. And I lack the discipline to be very safe and cautious here, and it's just because this e6 weakness would come back to really bite me. White now played queen e2, and that's just a good move, retreating the queen, but keeping it on the same line as the e6 pawn. And now white has a very clear plan of just playing like bully ball on the e6 pawn, so it's already kind of tough to defend it. I now played c5, and that was actually part of my idea with f5, was that now the queen does move away, my bishop is liberated on the diagonal. But again, I traded one weakness for another. So I traded my lack of space for a pawn weakness on e6 that's chronic, and maybe it would have been better just to play with the lack of space. After c5, rook fe1 was played, just hitting e6. Note that taking on d4 doesn't really help me that much, because after knight takes d4, more pieces converge on the e6 pawn. So instead, I just went rook a e8, keeping the tension. And now white played rook a d1, excellent move, also keeping the tension. And the point is actually white has a lot of useful moves that can keep tension here, and I don't. White can entertain playing like h4, knight g5, for instance, and put pressure on the pawn that way. white can maybe consider doubling on the d file, and I just don't have the luxury of having a lot of good waiting moves. Note that a move like h6, which seems supernatural, might be problematic because of knight h4, and taking advantage of the new weakness that's created on g6 by me pushing the pawn. So I actually don't have a lot of good moves just to hold my position together. Because of that, after rook a d1, I went bishop e4, and I thought this was kind of a clever try. The point is that I get my bishop and post it up right next to the light-squared bishop so that whenever the knight moves, I do at least get to trade one of white's really powerful pieces. One of the things I had to be worried about here is white actually playing d5 and locking my bishop out. So, for example, let's say I went h6. After d5 and e5, there's knight h4, and, well, you could see it, first of all, that this pawn chain is just locking my bishop out, and second of all, there's a new weakness on g6. Another thing just to keep in mind is that if I take on d5, you might say, well, isn't everything fine? Isn't the material just going to be level after c takes d5? Well, not so fast. At first, white can play queen takes e7, and after rook takes e7, rook takes e7, and then rook takes e7, bishop takes e7. Now there's actually the very, very annoying, actually maybe not instead of rook takes e7, maybe starting with knight h4. That might actually be stronger, but the point is that whichever way you play, the issue is that after knight h4, there's this pin here, and so white actually recovers the pawn with interest because of the positional advantages that come about because of me weakening all my light squares with f5 and e takes d5. So the point is that black is really struggling even with the queens off the board. You see me hesitate because I'm not quite sure if white should trade on e7 multiple times before moving the knight or move the knight right away. But in any case, the problem is that this bishop on b7 is indeed pinned when the knight actually moves from f3. So anyways, I just played bishop e4 so that after d5, my bishop isn't locked out of that pawn chain. So I thought this was a decent move. And now black went d takes c5, decide, you know what, I've had enough of keeping the tension. And here I played a very, very serious mistake that pretty much took me out of the game a little bit. The better move would have been to go bishop takes c5, and the point is that in many lines I'm actually pressuring on the f2 pawn on the diagonal, so I have some ideas of maybe going knight f6, knight g4, and just kind of the bishop is on a nice outpost here. Instead, I actually played knight takes c5, and the problem here is that after bishop e5, these bishops getting traded actually helps white because it means that I'm not going to have any counterplay on white's king. So very, very important finesse, taking with the bishop instead of the knight, just to have some counterplay for my backward e-pawn. And here just forces the trade of bishops. So I went bishop takes e5, and after knight takes e5, queen c7, and now queen b2, really excellent move, protecting the knight on e5 and also unleashing the rook on the e-file, and just very, very annoying move to deal with, keeping the tension. I now went bishop takes g2, and after king takes g2, this is the type of enduring, unpleasant endgame that I was talking about 10 or so moves ago that can happen in these Catalan positions. Basically, the material is equal, but white has several things going for him. First of all, he has a queenside pawn majority, which is easier to mobilize than a kingside pawn majority, in part because the kings are on that side of the board. So in endgames, having the queenside pawn majority is a nice thing to have. The other significant advantage white has is just the activity of the rooks. My rooks on f8 and e8 are extremely passive, whereas white's rooks on e1 and d1 are extremely active. And last but not least, the pawn structure. I would love if this pawn was back on f7 now, but it's not. And what it means is my pawns are very, very weak. So just a very, very difficult position to play and deal with. And yeah, it is what it is. So anyways, after king takes g2, I went rook e d8, trying to maybe trade some pieces and relieve the congestion here, because clearly the rook on d1 is more active than my rook. And now white went b4, good move, already mobilizing his majority on the queen side. And this is just going to be very, very difficult to hold. I now had a very tough choice about where to move my knight to. There are pretty much two candidate moves, either e4 or d7. And there are pros and cons to both, but there's one that's clearly better than the other. And the best move is actually knight d7. And the point is, this knight on e5 is so active that it needs to be exchanged, because I just can't tolerate this knight for too long, because it actually makes my king very, very airy. Note that with the knight on e5, I have back rank problems because I can't go to f7 in endgames, and the knight just controls too many important squares in my camp. So it would have been important to actually trade that one and get to a rook endgame where I'd have chances to hold. Even after the exchange, after knight takes d7, rook takes, and queen e2, this position is still incredibly unpleasant, because even now the heavy pieces are more active than my heavy pieces. But this is something where I could fight. I mean, I can try and fight. I'm still material. The material's still equal, and, black is by no means losing. It's just unpleasant and would require defense. And maybe my king could even come to f7 and help out with the e6 pawn at some point. So this would have been a better way to go. Instead, I kept the knights on the board with knight e4, and the truth is, this knight on e4 is going to be easily challenged, while my knight on e5, while white's knight on e5 is not. The point is, white always has f3 to kick my knight, and I don't have the same luxury because I've, again, moved my f-pawn a little bit too far. So after knight e4, white went f3 right away, just kicking the knight away, and I went knight f6, and now queen e2 is played, and you can see white pretty much has the same position we looked at, but with the knights on the board still. And you see my knight has very limited scope in the center right now, whereas white's knight is dominant. So should have traded those knights. After queen e2, I played rook f8, just prophylactically defending e6. But this doesn't really help my cause, and you can see I'm very much in a defensive posture. And now white went for the move b5. And b5 is a really, really nice move, because now he's actually threatening knight c6. And what knight c6 does, it gives white complete control of the d-file, because, the knight would be controlling the d8 square. So he's pretty much trying to control the one open file with his pieces. And with the knight on c6, my rook on e8 is going to be really lacking squares. So already very, very tough position for me now. And, practically speaking, it's lost. A computer can fight on for a long time, but very, very unpleasant. I went knight d7 now, and knight d7 is actually the losing move. The only move in the position to try and play on would be knight e4. And this is a really neat tactical idea, which I had seen actually, with the point to actually threaten the knight on e5 and also reinforce a knight c3 threat. The reason I rejected this was because of knight c6, rook takes d1, and queen takes d1. And I was a little bit concerned here that white still has control of the file and is very active. But at least trading one rook helped me a little bit. And now my knight on c5 has a reasonable outpost compared to before, where it's just on f6 kind of floundering. So this would be a position where I could still fight, although white is still significantly better. Instead, I went knight d7, and this is just too little too late, because if I want to trade those knights, I should have done it a while ago. Because now white goes knight c6, and you can see here that white's dominating the d-file, my knight's passive, and his knight stays on the board. I went rook c8, and now white went rook d2, and you can see this is now clinical, because Evgeny can just double the rooks and invade, and I can't even contest on the d-file, because again, my rook can't come to e7 or d8. So it's just completely winning. I went knight c5, at least moving it away from the d7 square, just anticipating rook e d1. And now white went rook e d1 anyway. And it's very, very hard to move anything here. My knight can't move because rook d7 is a threat. My rook on c8 can only go to a8. My rook on e8 can only go to f8. And white's also threatening rook d6 in many lines, targeting the e6 pawn. So very, very tough position. I went a6 trying to liberate my structure, in part because I thought, well, if my rook on c8 has no squares, maybe it can get counterplay on the a file. But this doesn't help very much, because now white just goes rook d6 anyway, and the point is he's just too fast invading in the center. I went a takes b5, and after c takes b5, I went rook a8 trying to get some counterplay on a2. But now white goes knight e5. And this idea I actually missed. The point I thought was to actually pressure e6. But the real idea was actually to secure the c6 square for his rook. And with the other rook being on d1, it's a real problem if his rooks control the d and c file. So very, very nice maneuver, and something I just missed in my time trouble. I went rook e d8 now, trying to challenge those rooks. But rook c8 was played anyway, and you can see here this rook is so active. It's also hitting b6 in many lines, and so I'm really, really hard-pressed to defend all my pawns. I went queen e7, kind of jettisoning my b6 pawn. Part of the reason I did that is because after queen b7, white now has knight c4, I thought. Or maybe rook takes d8 first, and then rook takes d8, and now knight c4, and b6 is just dropping. So yeah, I thought there was not really much going anyway, and because of that, I went queen e7. But now rook takes d8, queen takes d8, and knight c4 anyway, and you could see that my b6 pawn is indeed dropping. I went queen d4, trying to get some counterplay, get some activity for that b pawn. But knight takes b6 was played, and it's well timed because it's also hitting my rook on a8 with tempo, so I actually have to move the rook. And now I played rook a3, trying to get super, super active, maybe eyeing f3, maybe in some lines switching over to d3 and getting some counterplay. But now white went for the very, very well timed rook takes c5. And this move, unfortunately, wins on the spot. The point is that after queen takes c5, there's queen takes e6 check, and if I go king f8, there's knight d7, which forks my queen, and if king h8, there's queen e8 mate. So just to show you that, after queen takes, queen e6, king f8, knight d7, that's a problem, and if king h8, queen e8, and there's the back rank issue. So after the move rook takes d5, I'd actually seen enough and resigned. I must say, it was a really, really tough game to lose, but at this point, I wasn't super, super surprised with my play. You know, at the end of the day, this would be 5 losses in a row now, and I was punch drunk. I was just taking beating after beating, and, you know, I couldn't stop the bleeding in any way, and it was really a shame because there were still 4 rounds to go, and it's just a horrible, horrible feeling to, you know, be playing so badly and to just enter a game and think, well, what's going to go wrong today? Because that was pretty much the feeling that I'd had at this juncture. But in any case, it is what it is, and I was just trying to see if I can learn from it, because, you know, every game, you know, win, loss, or draw, you can learn some things, and especially from the losses. My grandma always used to say when she took me to tournaments, did you win or did you learn? So I was just trying to learn and, you know, stay positive and all those good things, but it was really tough, and it was certainly hard to keep. It was hard to keep my head up with 5 losses in a row. Anyways, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, please do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks. Take care.